In the quiet neighborhood of Beverly Hills, not far from Sunset Boulevard, sits a Spanish-style mansion with pale stucco walls and arched windows. For decades, it was the home of Gene Kelly, the legendary dancer and actor whose smile lit up Hollywood musicals. He died there in 1996, but the house never lost its connection to him, or so the new owners would come to believe. When a young couple purchased the property in the early 2000s, they were captivated by its history. The curved staircase, the polished hardwood floors, and the mirrored studio room where Gene once rehearsed, all of it felt like stepping into Hollywood's golden age. They told friends they could almost hear music lingering in the air. First, it seemed charming. But soon, the house revealed something stranger. On quiet evenings, the couple often heard faint tapping sounds, rhythmic and precise, as if someone were practicing dance steps in the empty studio. At first, they assumed it was the old wooden floors settling. But the sound grew sharper, louder, heel-toe until it echoed through the halls. When they rushed in, the room was always empty. They tried to ignore it, until one night they both woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of a gramophone spinning. A faint melody drifted down the hallway, singing in the rain. The couple didn't own a record player. Yet when they opened the studio door, the air smelled faintly of rain and cigar smoke, and the mirrored wall was fogged over, as if someone had been dancing hard inside. Visitors to the home reported the same unease. One friend swore she saw a shadow twirl across the studio floor, gliding gracefully, then vanish at the corner of her eye. A contractor hired to repair the roof quit after a week, saying he heard someone humming, like an old movie star, whenever he worked near the attic. The owners began keeping the studio locked. But the door never stayed that way. More than once, they woke to find it wide open, the mirrored wall faintly vibrating as though someone had just brushed against it. And always, the sound of soft footsteps receded down the hall, never toward them, always leading deeper into the house. By then, the couple no longer joked about the place. They began wondering whether Gene Kelly, so devoted to his art, had never really left. The house wasn't menacing, but it wasn't peaceful either. It was alive with memory, with movement, with something that refused to rest. The new owners quickly learned that the strangeness in Gene Kelly's old house was not confined to its mirrored studio. The energy of the place seemed to bleed into every corner, quietly asserting itself in ways that were both subtle and undeniable. The first signs came in the evenings, when the house took on an atmosphere that felt markedly different from the warmth it carried in the day. During the day, sunlight poured through the arched windows, filling the rooms with a golden glow that made the tiled floors gleam. At night, however, the shadows seemed to thicken unnaturally. The long hallway leading from the living room to the studio always appeared darker than the rest of the house, as if the light bulbs strained to push back against something unseen. Even when they replaced the fixtures, the glow along that stretch of corridor remained weak, leaving the couple with the uneasy feeling that the house wanted it that way. One particular evening, the husband stood in that hallway with a glass of water in his hand, staring toward the closed studio door. He was trying to shake off the tension that had become part of their nightly routine, when suddenly the faintest creak of floorboards broke the silence. It came from the other side of the studio door. He held his breath, waiting. Then came another sound, a slow, deliberate shuffle, followed by a soft tapping, as though a shoe had brushed against polished wood. It was so distinct that he dropped the glass, water spreading across the floor at his feet. Gathering his courage, he pushed open the door, only to find the studio empty, its wide mirrors reflecting his own pale face back at him. And yet the air inside was heavy, almost electric, as though the room had been occupied just moments before. The wife experienced her own unsettling moments, most often in the mornings. She would be in the kitchen preparing coffee when a chill drifted through the room, lowering the temperature enough to make her shiver. At first, she thought it was the old windows letting in drafts, but then she noticed that the chill seemed to follow her movements. If she crossed the kitchen toward the stove, the cold would shift and settle behind her, as if something were standing close enough to brush her back. On more than one occasion, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see a figure lingering in the doorway. It wasn't just them who felt it. Friends who visited the home described the same sensations. One guest insisted that he heard faint whistling in the courtyard while smoking a cigarette outside, whistling so distinct and rhythmic that he assumed someone was standing just out of sight. When he went to look, the yard was empty, bathed only in moonlight. Another visitor, seated in the living room late at night, claimed that the grand piano in the corner let out a single note all on its own, though no one had touched it in years. The most disturbing moments came when both owners were together in the house and experienced the phenomenon simultaneously. One night, as they sat in the living room with the television muted, they both heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps descending the staircase. It was a steady, confident stride, not the creak of wood shifting, but the deliberate rhythm of a person's weight pressing against each step. The husband rose quickly, heart pounding, and looked up toward the landing. The staircase was empty, yet the sound continued, moving downward until it reached the floor below. Then silence. By now, the house was no longer simply a beautiful relic of old Hollywood to them. It was something they felt they were sharing their lives with, something that had a presence. It wasn't violent, but it demanded recognition. They could not ignore it any longer, and deep down, neither of them truly wanted to. Because along with the fear came a strange sense of awe, as though the house itself was breathing with the echoes of its former life. And then came the night when the wife, unable to sleep, wandered into the darkened living room at 3 in the morning. The moonlight spilled through the windows, catching the surface of the grand piano. She froze where she stood, because in the reflection of the glossy black lid she swore she saw the silhouette of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his posture unmistakably graceful, as if he were about to step into a dance. She blinked, and the figure was gone. But the air smelled faintly of rainwater again, just like the first night they had heard "Singin' in the Rain," playing from nowhere. The couple now began to question whether they were witnesses to Gene Kelly's spirit, not in some malicious form, but as a lingering force tied inseparably to his art, his home, and his devotion to performance. The house, they realized, was not simply haunted, it was alive with memory. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The days inside the house grew heavier, as though each passing week deepened its hold on the new owners. What had once been subtle disturbances, the faint tapping of footsteps, the whistling in the yard, the chilled air in the kitchen, now unfolded with a confidence that no longer allowed them to dismiss what they were living through. It was as if the house had decided they were ready to hear more, to see more, to feel more of what still lingered there. The shift began in the mirrored studio. The couple had avoided it for weeks, but the door refused to stay shut. No matter how carefully they turned the lock, they would find it standing open in the morning. The smell of wood polish and something older, dust, sweat, even the faint suggestion of cologne hanging in the air. One night, determined to reclaim control, the husband entered the room just before midnight. The hardwood gleamed under the moonlight, and the wall-length mirrors reflected the pale glow in endless repetition. He stood still, waiting, when a faint vibration stirred under his feet. Then came the sound, a soft brushing against the floor, like the sweep of a leather sole across polished wood. His chest tightened. A second step followed, this time sharper, deliberate, as though a dancer was finding the beat. He could hear it clearly now, the rhythm building: step, shuffle, tap, glide. Invisible feet moving with precision, the floorboards resonating beneath them. The mirrors trembled almost imperceptibly, and in the corner of his vision he thought he saw the brief flash of a figure, just a blur, the outline of a man in motion, but when he turned his head, there was nothing. Yet the rhythm carried on until suddenly it stopped, leaving the room in a silence so thick it seemed to press against his eardrums. He left the studio that night shaken, knowing without doubt that someone or something still claimed it. The wife's encounters took a different form. She found herself drawn to the courtyard in the evenings, where the tiled fountain still trickled with water. It was a beautiful spot, framed with ivy and shaded by citrus trees, but the peace of the courtyard never lasted long. She began to notice the scent of damp pavement even when the skies were clear, a smell she associated with a sudden burst of summer rain. And with it came the faintest sound of humming, soft, melodic, always just beyond her reach. Once, while she leaned over the fountain, she felt a drop of water strike her shoulder. She looked up quickly, expecting to see the first signs of rain, but the sky above was cloudless, filled with stars. The courtyard remained dry, except for the single drop that had landed on her. Friends who visited became increasingly unsettled. One evening, a guest excused herself to use the upstairs bathroom, only to return pale and trembling. She claimed that when she passed the hallway mirror outside the guest bedroom, she saw someone following behind her. She described the reflection of a man, his expression unreadable, walking with an elegance that felt rehearsed. When she spun around, the hall was empty, but the mirror showed a faint smear across its surface, as though a hand had brushed against it moments earlier. The house began asserting itself during daylight hours as well. While preparing lunch one afternoon, the wife heard the unmistakable sound of piano keys drifting from the living room. It wasn't random notes, it was a melody, slow and deliberate, a piece neither of them recognized. She rushed in, only to find the grand piano silent, its lid closed, a layer of dust undisturbed across the keys. Yet the sound lingered in her mind as if it had been played directly into her memory. The nights became the most difficult. Sleep was fractured, restless, filled with dreams that seemed less like imagination and more like invitations. Both the husband and wife reported dreams of dancing not themselves, but watching someone else. A man gliding across the floor of the studio, his movements graceful, his energy so strong that they woke with their hearts racing, as if they had witnessed something real. More than once, they woke at the same exact moment, gasping, as if the same dream had been shared between them. Then came the incident that marked a turning point. It was late, nearly 3 in the morning, when the couple sat awake together in bed, too unsettled to sleep. A sudden sound echoed through the house, a heavy thud, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps moving across the downstairs living room. They froze, straining to listen. The footsteps did not wander aimlessly. They formed a pattern, steady and precise, almost like choreography. And then, just as they thought it would end, a voice drifted upward through the silence. It wasn't clear or loud, but it carried the cadence of someone rehearsing lines or lyrics, half-sung, half-spoken. The husband gripped his wife's hand so tightly that her knuckles ached. Neither dared to move. The sound eventually faded, but the air in the house felt charged, humming with invisible energy. They knew now that this was not something they could dismiss as tricks of the mind or old wood settling. The house was alive with the spirit of its past owner, a presence that refused to fade. And whether they admitted it or not, they both felt the same mix of dread and reverence each time it revealed itself. The mansion no longer felt like it belonged to them. It belonged to him. The house seemed to breathe differently as summer turned into fall. The golden light of California evenings, once warm and inviting, now cast long shadows across the courtyard that clung to the tiled walls like stains. The couple began to notice how their lives had shifted around the strange rhythm of the place. They no longer invited friends over for dinners, no longer lingered in the studio with its mirrors and polished floor. Their movements grew quiet, subdued, as if they were merely guests in a home that didn't want them to forget who had lived there before. The wife was the first to sense that the disturbances weren't random. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, she found herself humming unconsciously. It wasn't a song she knew well, just a fragment of melody that seemed to rise from nowhere. She only realized later that it was the opening bars of You Were Meant for Me, one of Gene Kelly's old numbers. She couldn't remember ever hearing it in full, and yet the tune had slipped from her lips as if someone had placed it there. That night, while brushing her teeth, she heard the same song drifting faintly from the courtyard. No instrument, no voice, just the sense of music filling the air like mist. The husband grew more haunted by the studio. He avoided it, but the room wouldn't let him stay away. The mirrors began to feel like eyes, catching him whenever he passed the hallway, reflecting something more than just his own image. He described once walking past late at night and seeing not his reflection, but the quick flick of a man's hand, as though someone was tipping a hat in salute. The gesture was so fluid, so unmistakably theatrical, that he stumbled backward and nearly fell down the stairs. When he returned to look again, The mirror showed only his pale face, but the feeling of being acknowledged lingered, chilling and intimate. The courtyard fountain began to misbehave as well. The water, usually steady, started spurting at odd hours, sending sudden sprays into the air as though stirred by unseen hands. Once, the couple awoke to the sound of rushing water and found the fountain overflowing, its tiled edges slick and glistening. Yet when they examined the plumbing the next day, everything appeared normal. The wife swore she saw footprints in the wet tile shapes that looked like dance shoes pressed into the thin sheen of water, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. At night, the house became a stage for something neither of them could escape. The footsteps that had once confined themselves to the studio now roamed the halls. They heard them pacing in the upstairs bedroom that had once been Gene Kelly's, crossing the floor with the same steady rhythm as if rehearsing a scene. Sometimes the steps stopped directly outside their own door, waiting there in silence, a presence so thick they could feel it pressing against the wood. One evening, desperate for answers, the husband stayed awake in the living room long after his wife had gone to bed. He kept the lights low, the curtains open, and sat in silence with nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Hours passed, and he began to feel foolish until the piano in the corner stirred. One key struck gently, hanging in the air like a single note in a rehearsal. Then another, forming the start of a tune. He sat frozen as a melody emerged, hesitant, incomplete, but undeniably deliberate. The sound filled the room, warm and melancholic, as if someone were practicing in the dark. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was unbearable. He didn't dare touch the piano the next morning. The dust across the keys was undisturbed, yet the memory of the music clung to him. The wife's breaking point came during a sleepless night when she walked to the courtyard just before dawn. The sky was pale gray, the air cool. She sat near the fountain, trying to calm herself, when she felt the undeniable sensation of movement beside her. Not wind, not shadow, but the presence of someone pacing the courtyard tiles. She turned her head slowly, and for the briefest instant, she swore she saw the outline of a man in motion, broad shoulders, straight posture, arms moving with rhythm, as though lost in a dance only he could hear. Then, just as quickly, he was gone, leaving her breathless, her skin cold as though rain had passed through her. By now, the couple spoke less and less about what they were experiencing. Though their silence was not denial, it was resignation. The house was speaking to them, showing them pieces of its former life, weaving them into a rhythm they hadn't asked to join. And while it was never cruel, never violent, the persistence of its presence wore them down. They no longer felt like owners. They felt like caretakers watching over a stage that remained occupied, even in death. The mansion had become a place where reality blurred with memory, where footsteps carried the weight of performances long finished, and where the very air seemed to hum with the spirit of a man who had once commanded every room he entered. And the more they stayed, the more they realized the truth they had resisted from the beginning. This was not their home to claim. It was still his. The turning point arrived late one autumn evening. The couple had retreated upstairs after dinner, weary from another day of inexplicable sounds and shifting shadows, when the familiar rhythm returned: heel, toe, shuffle, tap. But this time it wasn't confined to the studio or the staircase. The sound traveled deliberately through the house, moving from room to room, as if a performance was unfolding across the entire home. They sat together on the edge of their bed, listening as the steps circled below them, then ascended the stairs. The husband's hand shook as he reached for his wife's. The footsteps stopped directly outside their bedroom door. For a moment there was silence. Then came the unmistakable creak of the doorknob turning, not forced, not aggressive, but smooth, as though someone on the other side simply wanted to enter. The door opened half an inch. The couple's breath caught, waiting for what they would see. But nothing entered. Instead, the studio down the hall burst into life. Music swelled, faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't a record or a radio. It was live. The notes of a piano played with confidence, joined by the soft beat of invisible shoes striking wood in perfect time. The mirrors rattled with vibration, the sound filling the house until the very walls seemed to pulse with it. The wife, trembling, whispered, "He's still here. He never left." The husband, heart pounding, rose and stepped into the hallway. He could see the glow spilling from the studio doorway, though no light fixture was on. It was a silver luminescence, like moonlight concentrated in one room. Against his fear, he approached, drawn toward it. As he stood at the threshold, he saw the outline in the mirrors, not a clear figure, but a silhouette moving with impossible grace, arms extended, steps gliding across the floor. It was beautiful, hypnotic, yet filled with a sadness so deep it made his chest ache. The figure twirled once, paused, and then faded into the silver glow. Slowly, the light dimmed, the music softened, and silence settled back into the house. They both knew then that this was no ordinary haunting. It wasn't a warning or a curse. It was devotion, an echo of a man who had poured his soul into dance and film, who had loved this house because it was both sanctuary and stage. Gene Kelly had left his body decades ago, but something of him, the rhythm and the passion that defined him, had remained. The couple stayed in the house for another year, but the encounters never stopped. Sometimes the studio door would stand open, and they would hear faint shuffles across the wood. Other nights, a single note from the piano would drift through the darkness like a reminder. But it was no longer unbearable. They began to speak of the haunting not as torment, but as presence. "He's rehearsing," the wife would whisper when they heard the sounds. "He's keeping it alive." Eventually, however, the weight of living alongside such a powerful spirit became too much. They realized they could never truly make the home their own. The mansion wasn't hostile, but it wasn't empty either, and it never would be. With quiet respect, they put the property back on the market. When they moved out, they left the studio untouched. The mirrors still gleamed, the floorboards still shone, as if waiting. And in the nights after the house stood vacant, neighbors claimed they could still hear the faintest sound drifting from within, steps in rhythm, tapping across the floor, followed by the distant hum of a man's voice. Not violent, not frightening, just a reminder that Gene Kelly's stage had never gone dark. The house was his final performance, and he never left the spotlight. Would you spend a night here? Comment below. Which house should I do next?